Hi, welcome to CPE 270 Product Design Session 4, Ideation and Selection. Ideation is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically brainstorming, and it's characterized by creativity. And so this photograph I have included here is kind of a jokey way of saying, go apes when you're ideating. You don't need to be physical, you can be aphysical. You don't need to be practical, you can be impractical. And mostly, you just want a large number of ideas. What's not as important is the quality. And this is one of the few times in your degree when that's going to be true. Usually you'll find in a team that at some point your idea generation kind of stagnates. And so at that point, you can fall back on these bullet points, which have some suggestions for keeping the creative juices flowing. That's to invite criticism of an idea, and maybe from that criticism, generate an improved idea. Think about some of the assumptions. So a little bit of a twerky example is in the food packaging, we assumed that there was a solid, mostly impermeable material around the food. What if instead the food were submerged in something like liquid mercury? It's not physical and it's not really practical, but it's something outside the box that can help generate more realistic ideas. Creating analogies between ideas often helps connect things and make sort of these hybridized concepts. And you can also invert the problem. And here, if we think of our food packaging, the problem is to prevent or to detect spoilage in the food. But what if we actually made the food to be spoiled? What if it was something you put in fresh and it pickles in the package as it goes? Maybe our product should be a pickle. So that's ideation. What you might find is that you get a lot of ideas that are similar, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're good. And so I want to explain the availability bias, which is a cognitive bias. And the best way is through an example. If you have two flatmates, each is going to claim that she does the majority of the house cleaning. And each person believes that she's correct and is speaking honestly from her understanding. But obviously, you can't have more than one person doing the majority of the work, by definition. So what's going on? Well, it's quite common, but when you perform a task, you're very aware of having performed that task and you can remember it. So if I just sit here, I can think of, the past 5 things I've cleaned in the house, right? What I can't think of are the past 5 things my partner has cleaned. So because I think more frequently about my own tasks, because, that's just the nature of having done them myself, I overestimate the frequency with which I'm performing the tasks. This is actually quite similar to the way fake news spreads. So if someone reports something incorrect, which is then re-reported and re-reported, you start to hear it frequently. And because you can recall the frequency of it, you start to lend it more credibility. And yeah, that's actually kind of dangerous. So just be aware in working with teams that something that's frequent isn't necessarily correct. When it comes to selecting a product idea, you actually have to think quite a lot about the selection process. If you choose to go through a very fast selection process, you're going to come up with ideas that have higher risk, but they're probably going to be lower cost. The idea process is going to be lower in cost. If your selection process is slower, you'll be more careful, and the ideas you generate will be lower risk, but it's going to cost a lot more money to develop those ideas. And the idea here is that product development is actually very expensive. To illustrate that, I've got an example here where you've got a typical team of engineers who are working on product development. There's 7 of them, and they're going to work for 9 months to develop a product. And that's actually a pretty fast turnaround for a product. So what is the cost of this team? Well, this is actually just simple maths, right? You multiply the salary of each team by their representative abundance on the team, and add it all together. You get somewhere around 49,500 pounds. And you multiply this by 7 people on a team, and they're working for 9 months of the year, and their salary is based probably on about 11 months of work. And that gives you about 300,000 pounds. That's actually a lot of money, right? And that doesn't include the overheads of giving them a space to work in, computing hardware, computing software, administrator, receptionist, night guard, porter. It doesn't include insurance on the space or payment into their pension plans or perhaps other perks like life insurance. So the true cost is definitely going to be upwards of £500,000, and that's just to develop the idea. It doesn't mean that it's going to go to market. It's not necessarily going to be scaled up at this point. It's an expensive process. So there's an advantage in iterating very quickly, and some companies, kind of like the Google model, will choose to test hundreds, thousands of ideas very quickly with small investments, and then only pursue the most promising of the initial pool. All right, so when it comes to selecting these ideas, how do we screen them? A concept scoring matrix. I know you've seen this before. You have to choose your criteria, which are going to actually be set by the stakeholders usually, and the criteria are usually qualitative. And so that's why you kind of need to put them in a matrix to lend some kind of quantitative value to the whole process. And then whichever ideas you choose for screening, probably you'll be able to consolidate your hundreds of ideas into like sort of a top 20 themes of ideas. But we'll just demonstrate that. Going back to our food packaging idea, just for the first specification, I created some ideas around that. So that was S1, specification 1. The pressure in the package must not exceed ambient by more than X%. That's just one way of writing the specification. And so some ideas I just thought of really quickly. We'll put a pressure transducer in the package. Or 2, use a strain-sensitive die that will indicate when the material is stretched. 3, you can include a piezoelectric material and a plastic electronic LED that will light up when the pressure is a certain level. Or you could construct a one-way valve. None of these are really well thought out, but they're just ideas that you can start to score. And so if we put it into a scoring matrix, the criteria we might choose, again, this is set by our stakeholders and it's all qualitative. Things like scientific maturity, does it interact with the consumer, cost, legislation, does it meet those requirements, and how long is the development time? These are all very expected criteria. And so if I were going to rate my first idea, the pressure transducer, I might choose a scale of 1 to 10. And so for this pressure transducer, I'd say it's mature technology. It could potentially interact with the consumer. It's not going to be cheap. It can easily meet packaging requirements by laminating it, but the development time is probably going to be a little longer because it's a less tried technology for food packaging. And so then I would go ahead and do this for each of the ideas that I wish to evaluate, and the idea with the most points wins. You might get to the point where you actually find a winner and realize, oh, it's got the most points, but it falls down somewhere in the spider diagram of criteria. So you might need to go to an external consultant and actually collect more consumer information and start the ideation process again. You might need to iterate a couple of times, and whether you have that luxury depends on how much time and funding you have allocated to the product development process. So it's a very constrained problem. It's just not always clear which parts of the design process are the most constrained, and that's really for you and your team to decide. All right, with that, I'm going to thank you for watching this session, Ideation and Selection, and I will see you for our last video in the series, which is about risk and risk management. Thanks.